Hi, I want to make a video on things like death and pride. And in this video, I guess I want to describe how some further kind of cliche kind of things when it comes to human beings and the interaction between sentient beings and understanding sentient beings based on in my individual circumstance, in my experience, and understanding other people's experiences, and understanding the whole concept and social interaction, and understanding how the grass is greener on the other side sometimes, like death and life and the difference, and how back to this kind of equilibrium idea, and looking on the other side and how it's always greater on the other side, and how people are complacent until they know how good the other side actually is. So complacency, things like that, and pride, and how people don't know how good it is on the other side until they're actually on the other side. And that's exactly the point. People don't know how good it is on the other side. And people really, even though I think I made another video almost entirely on the subject, I guess coming at it from a different point of view, because that's really all you can do when you've gone through all the different subjects. And obviously there's probably a few more I've missed, but obviously, anyway, back to the idea, and it goes to the idea that people don't know how good it is. They're living, and they don't know how. Obviously, they've not existed before. They go through sleep, dreamless sleep, and they know exactly how that feels. Sort of like they go through, they've gone through non-existence before they existed, and they're going to go through non-existence after they die. And that's exactly the thing that's going to happen. But sort of like any circumstance you can think in life, they're stuck in a complacency. They live existence. That's why people deal with abusive relationships, negative circumstances, and things like that. And death and life is a good overall general example in describing this, but that's something we don't know, because obviously death is something that we can't experience because it's beyond our experience, because death is by very, very definition non-experience. We're not experienced, we're not sentient, we're not experiencing existence. But it's almost the same as sleeping, so it can be almost compared to sleeping, but because we're still sentient when we're sleeping. We're just not working in the same way. Our brain's functioning in a different way, in a more subconscious level, experiencing dreams and controlling things. And sometimes you can remember the dreams when you wake up, and so on and so forth. Subconsciously you can remember them, but in many cases you forget your dreams. But you can sort of vaguely remember them, and they can come back to you in certain cases. You remember very vague details and very general details of a dream and something, and that's a different subject, I guess. But it describes a good situation and making a distinction between existing and non-existing, and knowing the grass is green on the other side, because they are already existing. They're already existing, so they don't know how good it is to not exist, but you can't know it to not exist. Sort of like you can't know how bad a memory was until you remember it again. You can't know that you forgot something until you remember it again. So you can't you can't know death, because death by its very definition is not experience, but it's something that you can give you context. Say if you were existing, then you went to sleep, then you don't, then you're back to existing, experiencing consciously, seeing things through your point of view, through your focus, through your looking, through a rigid point of view, your focus that you look through every day. And obviously that's something that is biologically held, and that's the only thing that we can do is focus on so many things. You almost recognize you can only focus to a certain point, your focal point. And your focal point, you never really get your fingers on it. And that goes back to describing things like not being able to see certain things, and blurry vision. Oh, this is so going off subject, but it's just like not seeing certain things. You can only see focus to a certain degree. You can only see a fine point at the very end, but you don't know necessarily what the focus point is. You know where it's generally heading, but if I'm describing this right, but you don't necessarily know how fine the point is in which your focus is. You can understand it, but generally speaking, it's always kind of moving, and it's kind of feigning around. But anyway, back to the whole grass is greener concept. We don't know, and how, generally speaking, in life, it's a good example, a good metaphor, a good analogy to describe how the grass is greener, and it gives us context in making experiences and distinctions between sleeping and not sleeping, to get back into the details of that specific example. And obviously we know we have context, and when there's context we can sort of see how, oh, I didn't feel anything. I can recognize it because I woke up from that, and there was context before and context after, but death leads to no context, but it's generally speaking the same, and I think we can say that there's a context to it. And say, hypothetically speaking, if there was infinite regression, there was context before and after, I'm living the same existence, I forget it, I die, amnesia, and then I wake up again and I'm experiencing something, but I'm not experiencing something, there's no context when I'm not experiencing anything, when I'm not existing. By its very definition, death is not experience. It's not having cognitive function. You're no longer a sentient being, you're just flesh and bone, if not ash. And so we don't know the grass is greener until we're on the other side, and then we realize just how bad we had it. That's why people get stuck in abusive relationships, and that's a point I wanted to make to begin with, and that's why people get stuck and they almost become complacent. And complacency can breed a lot of contempt, and it can lead to you not even necessarily realizing your own biases and your own points of view based on the negative circumstance or the circumstance you're in, because until you realize full context that there's something greater than when you are, and that's what gives you the context, is knowing different states. And generally speaking, states, say a very generalized statement such as living with an abusive relationship, you don't know how good it is until you, obviously there's different subconscious, and there's different other things that have interactions, like different aspects of your existence and life that you're experiencing, all sorts of other things, other variables. But obviously, when you to think about something generally speaking, that can have an effect, and everything has an effect on everything. And generally speaking, that doesn't mean that there's not bigger effects on different things, because in and of itself, from our point of view especially, we can recognize bigger events and smaller events. And if some things are smaller events, even though they have an effect, the effect means that there's going to be some bigger event that happens in effect from that effect. And that doesn't mean, since everything has an effect on everything, that doesn't mean that the effects that everything has are all equal. There's some effects that have more effect, and that's what these little effects mean something, because these effects lead to just other effects that have bigger meanings. And these effects mean something because they have bigger meanings to sentient beings that are experiencing these effects and causes. And it leads to just more effects having more effects, and that goes back to the redundancy of life and experience. And, based on these effects, leading to another effect that gives us our experience either a positive or a negative, or a non-negative or a more negative, more or less negative, closer to zero or further away from zero. And that's what we're experiencing on a day-to-day basis, and experiencing these things. And that's exactly what we're fighting and looking at. Looking in the mirror every day and recognizing these things. So, yes, and another point I wanted to make is this, I think that's a good video in and of itself. I might make that another video, but I think I just want to mention, that's exactly the point. And the point is we don't know how good it is until we're on that side, until we have full context of a situation. The context gives us full understanding of a situation and just how bad it may have been. And we don't know until we have greater context to a certain situation, describing a certain situation. And the certain situation can be either big or small, and the big or small, based on these interactions, are the only thing that matter. The interactions matter, but the interactions are caused by other interactions, small or big, and just because everything has an effect, like these interactions, because there's just one big interaction based on this reality, doesn't mean that there's not one more bigger interaction or the other. Obviously, it's a snowball effect, where it's how big an interaction could get based on certain circumstances, leading to all these little grouped together interactions, sort of like separating, putting atoms and molecules. You could separate them into different things, sort of like different causes and effects, and contriving a wall around certain interactions, and causing this the initial cause and effect, causing this, like me touching the pillow vibrating, causing this to vibrate, bunch of vibrations, and force feedback mechanisms, so like equal opposite reaction when I touch something, a force, and it comes back with me an equals opposite reaction, because that's how force works. That's almost like the equilibrium in description, but you can apply that to a fairness or a game when sentient creatures are not applying some kind of equilibrium in the deterministic universe based on things that are already happening, applying that to a vague concept of situation to begin with, determinism equals equilibrium, but we're living based on a fairness, a sentient being, we're existing, and the idea of equilibrium does not apply to the sentient experience experiencing something. It can only apply, if anything, if at all, to the idea that something's going to happen a certain way, and things usually compensate in a way for other things that don't happen or happen a certain way. That there's some kind of thing that's going to happen, and they happen a certain way. And you can't apply that to the sentient welfare being. You can only apply that to different aspects of a deterministic universe. And since we're in this deterministic universe, and since we're matter, and this is the only thing that makes it matter, is this thing that is beyond that deterministic mechanism. The distinction is that we're feeling, and you can't apply equilibrium to, there's 20 billion people that died in the past, therefore that was an equilibrium that's going to have. No, you can't apply that, because there has to be some kind of comparison to create that equilibrium to give you an idea of what the equilibrium is. And just because it existed doesn't mean it's an equilibrium. It just means it exists, and that's the way it happened to be. Because we're sentient beings, and there's a distinction. And that distinction is important. The distinction is we're sentient beings. We care about our well-being and other people's generally speaking, to other people's well-beings, and that means something beyond not fairness and an equilibrium. Equilibrium is completely separate. So I guess I went off on a limb there, but yeah. Context, interactions, you can contrive things like that, sort of like contriving a wall or a barrier around certain interactions, even though it's just a bunch of chaotic interactions going down the photons and atoms and such. You can moleculize them and make them into one molecule and describe a certain situation more accurately, sort of like you can accurately more describe a situation, or even generalize a certain situation, describing a generalized experience, or a generalized experience about contriving an experience, about how a certain experience can be either negative or positive, and you don't know how great it is until you give context to that generalized experience of experiencing something very generally when you're putting all these things, because you can almost not describe something exactly because it's just a bunch of interactions, and describing accurately almost downplays or undermines the fact that it's just a bunch of interaction based on a bunch of very small pieces moving together, creating bigger pieces based on our perceptions and interacting with the environment. So obviously that has an effect on how we perceive things, because on our level we perceive things on our level. Obviously, unless we're not looking at the wall behind us, and then obviously it's just a bunch of atoms that I'm interacting on my level based on my senses interacting on the level that they're interacting with. I'm sorry I'm talking so fast. I'm just trying to get through all these ideas. So I think that's all I want to say. Yeah, just a bunch of interactions, and you don't know how important it is to make the more defined distinction describing reality. You don't know how important it is until you recognize the distinctions and how you give context to a certain situation. And that's why a lot of people live in abusive relationships, and they get complacent. They don't know until they get out of that generalized experience and then go to something else. So I went off on generalized experience as well. So yeah, you don't know until you've seen the grass, or you've seen the other side, but there's a wall in the way in many cases. So it's about seeing the other side and giving greater context to recognizing just how bad you have it. And people live with it, and they think that's the way life is until they realize just how good it is. So like someone finally doing a drug, and oh, I feel so high, I love the high, it's so great, I like getting drunk. And then they realize that's a negative in and of itself. And the way it compensates because it's a negative, but you get positive, but also there's a negative consequences, right? So there you go. There's your equilibrium if you want any. So if at all, yeah. Anyway, I think that's it. I think that's all I need to say before I lose my voice. So yes, I'm gonna lose my voice. So yes, that's it. I think that's all I need to say. I might mention this in another video, but I think I mentioned it good enough. And yes, grass is greener on the other side, and sometimes you don't know it, and you don't really understand life in its full context, or how good it can be, or how much better it could be if you were in some other position instead of the position you are in. And we're willing to put up with things because we're in those complacent positions all the time, and we don't realize just how bad it is, or how good it can be when we're stuck in the situations that we're in, say it bad or good, or less bad or more bad, or less to zero or closer to zero or further away from zero. So anyway, thank you, and until next time, bye.